The Volcano. That decision, as they feared, made him more angry. There was no covering up the fact that they were seeking help. In the first meeting, he berated the counselor for labeling him as stupid. He railed against his teacher and his peers in detail, and he stomped out at the end without saying goodbye. "At least," said Dr. Tombrock, "he talked. It's much harder if a boy won't talk." As he went to more sessions, always against his will, Tigrid excoriated the school and its many stupid policies. He criticized California and the way people lived, and how all the kids just wanted to play video games. He said that no one respected people like Captain Stockton. And then he came around to the playground. On this topic, he fulminated without reserve, condemning all those around him and, most of all, the insurance companies. From there, he often launched seamlessly into describing his dreams, how unrealistic they were, and how implausible the children's injuries were, but also how he liked how he could explode each of the ghosts into a puff of smoke at will. Dr. Tombrock was, however, not very worried about these interviews. He and the Schauts met one morning while Tigrid was at school. "First of all," he said, "I believe the teachers were too quick to suggest he could become a bully. They reach for that word all too often these days. Tigrid doesn't lord his gold stars over the others because he's mean. It's just the only way he can reify his achievements. The problem is that Tigrid doesn't feel he gets recognition for his accomplishments, and his definition of an accomplishment does not include things like spelling a word right. Boys feel good when they feel competent, and he has no concrete way to demonstrate his value. And that doesn't include blue ribbons for things that are easy or constant praise for every little thing he does. He is sensitive about praise because he doesn't trust it. If he always gets praise, it has no value." "I see," said Rupert, leaning back in his chair. "That's why Mr. Stockton, Captain Stockton, Tigrid has corrected me on this before, has been such a good influence. From what I can tell, he doesn't praise Tigrid at all. He simply works together with him toward a worthwhile goal." "So what should we be doing?" "Listen to the captain and try to do what he does. You can't be the same person, of course. But when Tigrid learns a new word, instead of praising him for it, make a game of topping it with a better word, a synonym, for example, that you use in the next sentence. He'll feel like a warrior, a worthy adversary. That will strengthen his self-esteem more than any gold star." They talked about a few other strategies. On a math question, for example, instead of praising him for doing it correctly, they might ask him if he could have answered a harder one. When he says yes, and he will say yes, ask him what it would be. Now he's not just a kid, he's an expert. Rupert and Annabelle were animated. "It's so nice to have something to do, not to just talk about," said Annabelle. Rupert had one more question. "You'll forgive me, Dr. Tombrock, but as an engineer myself, I have to know the whole picture, warts and all. Did you find anything we should worry about?" "Nothing, really. Someone say he has a personality type with an unusual descriptor, but the important thing to remember is that there are some things from the recent past that have disrupted him somewhat. The move from Ohio was, as I think you know, traumatic, more than anyone could have predicted. A child can sometimes take a long time to express his feelings, and in the meantime, he may suppress them or present as unhappy in seemingly unrelated ways. Even though it took place some time back, under the surface, it may seem very recent to him. That's all common for boys in his situation. What's different and encouraging with Tigrid is that he has been very specific about his feelings. Even if they are presented in an angry manner, he has clear complaints that could be put into a list. They aren't a mass of disjointed thoughts. He mentions them in a somewhat random order, but they have consistent connections. And something else, and this is very important, Mr. and Mrs. Schaut. The fact that he can control his dreams indicates that he feels control over his life. I can't be sure, but I think that improved when Captain Stockton started helping him with his projects. What is needed is to direct that sense of control in a constructive way. Like the captain, said Annabelle. In your own way. You are wonderful parents and set a good example. Children usually follow their parents' footsteps over time. And as for his behavior with peers, well, you can't remote control it. All you can do is listen and remind him when the opportunity arises, not as a formal lesson, how to interact well with others. Rupert nodded, and Annabelle leaned forward to say thank you. But Rupert said, "You mentioned an unusual descriptor. What is it?" Dr. Tombrock cast his eyes down, frowned, and clasped his hands together. Now, I'd like to remind you that it is not a judgment or final diagnosis, not in any way. So don't let the terminology scare you. These things change rapidly, but according to my rubrics, he would, for the time being, provisionally, be referred to as having some signs of emergent psychopathic narcissism. The name alone put them into shock, and the implications, after listening further to Dr. Tombrock, were terrifying. It certainly focused their minds. We've been letting him be alone too much, said Annabelle. We thought it was good for him because it gave him room for his independence and intelligence, but it just left him without guidance. Rupert said, the reason I never showed up in his dreams to help him is because he doesn't trust me enough as a father, isn't it? Dr. Tombrock settled them down. Just do what we were talking about before, and most of all, relax. This will take patience. We've talked about quality time. Yes, said Rupert. You get that with quantity time. Right, said Dr. Tombrock. Availability time. And predictability, said Annabelle. Just take it one day at a time, said Dr. Tombrock. A spring morning. The first thing they did was rearrange Rupert's office so that he and Tigrid could work there at the same time, whether that was their own work separately or their work together on models. Annabelle read his chapter books with him in the living room, and she revived her old hobby of watercolors for him. They could work on them anywhere, even at the park. Rupert put more attention into inspecting his extra work, and even set up a grading system, one where he tried not to give hundreds. Tigrid would study his scores, working out averages and goals for how he could achieve a certain level. He poured his energy into reaching them, and seemingly forgot to show them off to his peers. They made sure he had a full schedule on free days, including a trip to McDonald's both Saturday and Sunday every weekend, and they made sure he was on a town team, soccer, and after that, swim. Over the next couple of months, Tigrid released a cataract of thoughts and emotions about school, his peers, and everything else, and he seemed to unwind. The circles under his eyes faded. He came to accept Randall and some other boys for who they were and began to spend time with Jay again, sharing some of the knowledge he had gained from Captain Stockton rather than casting him aside as soon as his contributions had been exhausted. Miss March could report honestly that Tigrid's behavior was that of a much more settled and easygoing child. He still refused to use the playset in the park, but that bothered no one. They weren't expecting him to, and he was getting too old for it anyway. It was as if the whole household had been holding its breath for months and could finally exhale. Everything was more relaxed, and Tigrid's parents again became optimistic about his future. The descriptor, a term that had plagued them for months, faded, as did the word bully. And Tigrid's dreams tapered off. He stopped mentioning them to his parents, and he didn't even bring them up with Dr. Tombrock, whose sessions became more unremarkable with each visit. Tigrid's thoughts centered on things like his projects and things he had done with his peers, not against them. I have good news, Dr. Tom Brock told Rupert and Annabelle in one of their parent-only meetings. He's boring me to death. Rupert responded, "We'll take that B word any day of the week." The plague. The summer went well, and third grade had a smooth start. There were no special conferences in the fall, and Tigrid's crisis seemed to be firmly in his past. They even cut the meetings with Dr. Tom Brock down to once a month, just so as not to lose touch. Unfortunately, that which no one expected, that which no one wanted, was prepared for, or had ever seriously feared, struck the world, the nation, the state, the family, and of course, Tigrid. The Wuhan virus, the pandemic, later known as COVID-19. And Tigrid loved it. He was not very much afraid of the illness. In fact, in his heart he had every confidence he would never be affected by it. He watched the news with his parents and took only mild interest as it crept from China to Italy to France, swung back to Russia and on to England, took a flight or a cruise to Washington State and the Empire State, and finally made its run down California to Santa Maria and, potentially, his school. To Tigrid, this was an opportunity to display his conscientiousness. He had picked up that East Asian countries had long worn masks just for regular colds, and he correctly predicted they would be coming to the U.S. too. He arrived at school with an N95 mask, which he knew to find at the paint section of Home Depot after they found that they were sold out at the pharmacy. This impressed his parents, as they had not even known what an N95 mask was. He made his parents buy surgical masks as well online before they got into short supply. He found it ironic that the masks were made in Wuhan, China. Fake school. He didn't have long to shine, however, as the 2 weeks to slow the spread took effect and everyone was kept out of school. But this proved another opportunity for him, because he was able to show that he could log on for remote learning without trouble, and that he never failed to submit an online assignment. He could see that many of his classmates were struggling, and he was able to help Miss March on more than one occasion when she had some sort of trouble with the user interface. Not just that, but he persuaded his parents to buy him an MCU 2P gas mask, surplus from the U.S. Air Force. They found it on eBay. It didn't fit, but it made him feel like a fighter pilot, which was his new goal. He wished above all else he could prove his bravery in the air one day, and he prayed the drones would not take over by the time he was old enough to enlist. He calculated that the F-35 would still be in service, but would be the last one with a pilot. He wished he could hurry up and get older before it was retired. Still, the routine of wearing masks everywhere outside the house got tiresome. Dr. Tom Brock had given Tigrid a lot of clues about reading people's expressions, and he did not like that the masks disrupted the easiest way to keep the upper hand on people. The same went for class online, where other children's faces were obscured by bad cameras or were too small to see. A lot of them also held the computer such that he couldn't see their faces at all, and Miss March didn't say anything to them. And then there were a few who wore masks even though they were on the computer in their own homes. His parents made him wear one everywhere outside the house, even at the park, afraid of attracting the attention of people like Mrs. Coleman, who had once taken it upon herself to scold them for going maskless. If he ran, he couldn't breathe well, and he would have to keep pushing it back up his face. His nose got slightly irritated by the somewhat stiff nose part of the mask, and the metal wire in it would sometimes poke him. "This could stick in my eye," he said. Because the school day video feed was too distracting for Rupert, they put the computer back in Tigrid's project room upstairs, where he could half listen to class while working in some model or other. Not a diorama on the level of the B-17, which would have demanded his full attention, but something small like a space shuttle. But Miss March occasionally suggested he wasn't listening. I can't tell if you're looking away, she said. Rupert and Annabelle saw him slip back into some old, unwanted habits, such as calling his classmates stupid, and, of course, complaining about the playground and the insurance companies. Dr. Tombrock would meet only through Zoom, and Tigrid began to sabotage the connection when it was time for a meeting. They eventually broke it off. The year ended pathetically. Miss March had them read out their plans for the summer. No one listened or had questions. Then she wished them a nice break and shut down the meeting. Their parents were to return the laptops within the week. The gray summer and a new annoying year. Rupert and Annabelle found a summer camp that was open, but with masks, which, with the heat and being outdoors, was unbearable for Tigrid. He refused to go after the first day and spent the summer at the house. He did a lot of projects, and he was able to talk to Captain Stockton a lot, and he finished his second model of the B-52. But time became a gray mist, and years later, he could hardly remember anything from it. Even with the boredom, Tigrid was hoping school would be remote again. There were certain advantages. The mask was not needed, but more to the point, those that couldn't concentrate in front of the screen fell back in class. His new teacher did not try to push him as long as he did what he needed to do, and he willingly allowed himself to disappear as his classmates absorbed more attention than ever. He got his wish. School would not reopen, but Rupert and Annabelle could see his lack of enthusiasm. They thought anything they did could only make things worse, so they had to accept it. At least he was more or less on an even keel. But one thing started to creep up on Tigrid's mind little by little. One of the things he did during dead time online was look up stories about COVID, and he kept seeing clues about how children hardly ever got the disease, and if they did, they very rarely died. He also learned more about how masks worked. It became a topic of conversation at dinner. Annabelle said, "If school reopens, they'll probably require them just to make sure." "But we know already," said Tigrid. "They won't make a difference." "They say to wear them," she said. "Why couldn't I just go without a mask? I mean, let everyone else do what they want, but just I won't do it." "Tigrid, the mask is to protect others, not the one wearing the mask," said Rupert. This statement surprised Tigrid. He knew that, but he didn't think his father did. He had noticed that most people had reverted to the belief that masks were not there to protect them, the wearers, not others. He had noticed that most people had reverted to the belief that masks were there to protect them, the wearers, and not others. He had planned his argument in advance, and his next step was going to be to insist on his own rights. His father had derailed that argument, and he lost his composure. "What if I don't care?" he said. "Tigrid, we're sure you care," said his father. "And don't forget that the teachers are older. What if they get sick?" That didn't bother Tigrid. He rather liked the idea of teachers withering and dying as he sat invincible on his desk. "But they won't," he said. "They're mostly too young, too. They're under 50. Rupert was too wise to remark on how surprising it was for a third grader to know that, but he immediately regretted what he did say. "They just think it's too much risk." Tigrid raised his eyebrows. "Do you mean the insurance companies think it's too much risk?" "No, it's just the state." "Other states don't do this." "Yes, they do." "No, they don't." "What about—" "Okay, maybe not all states, but we have to play the cards we're given. So they ruin everything for everybody just because of like 2 kids who die that were probably too weak to survive anyway. What is Ohio doing?" Rupert was ready for that at least. Ohio is not back in school. Tigrid was quiet for a moment. Private schools don't do it. That made Rupert and Annabel look at each other with a hint of fear. They had discussed private school before, mostly because of his behavior and to give him more of a challenge. But the only local schools were Christian or Catholic. Tigrid, said Rupert, we don't think you'd want to go to a private school. They're very strict. But all of this is just speculation. We can't switch you in the middle of the year anyway, and schools aren't even open yet. It is what it is. Tigrid spoke no further. He had plenty to say about private school, but he knew it cost money. Rupert and Annabel looked down as they finished the meal. The silverware sounded very loud. This, they suspected, was only the calm before the storm. And they were right. Tigrid complained about the insurance companies incessantly. He kept saying that Ohio was better. Dinners became sullen rituals. Tigrid did not ask for Rupert to help with models, and he did not talk to his mother about books. Is it old love or old hate? Rupert and Annabel tried valiantly to bring him around, and they talked together so they'd give him the same messages. He wasn't always upset. Tigrid did have his good days, and he did not have an impenetrable wall between him and his parents. When complaints arose, they would try to persuade him, but it only made him dig in his heels. Rupert's last serious effort on insurance companies went like this. Tigrid, insurance companies aren't all bad. We have insurance in case the house burns down. We have car insurance. We have life insurance. Tigrid peered around the house. Was there insurance for the pool? Well, yes. Rupert was not sure where this would lead. Is that why there's a fence around the pool? Yes. So the insurance companies make us put up a teeny-weeny little fence that anybody could jump over because they think that makes us safer? I think it's a state law. So the insurance companies make the state make up laws that say we have to put up a stupid little fence around. Tigrid, please stop complaining about the insurance companies. You can't control them. Sometimes you just have to take things in stride. Tigrid was quiet again, but Rupert could see, by the bulging carotid arteries, that he was not calm, that he was not satisfied. Another summer. The year trudged along and ended. Years later, Tigrid couldn't remember who his teacher was. It was even more of a gray smudge than the previous spring and summer. The Schauts went on a lot of camping trips in state. Tigrid loosened up considerably on them, and his parents had many talks about whether it was not being around the computer that had done it. Maybe it was just not being able to look things up about the coronavirus. They called Dr. Tombrock once, and he agreed. It was important to get back to nature and be together as a family. Everyone was getting cabin fever, and the news was only setting everyone on edge. A boy like Tigrid, he said, is like a kid who doesn't know his own strength. He's very intelligent, but doesn't yet know how to apply it. The information he finds online may be causing him more stress than he can handle. For this reason, they restricted his computer use to supervised times and to time with Captain Stockton. Tigrid resented this, but he started to forget about it after a while. He got going on a model of a B-29 Superfortress. It would be in distress, and the crew would be parachuting out. The parachuters were going to be a major challenge, and Tigrid seemed to lose himself in it. The Schauts wondered if all families had this kind of drama with their children. Dr. Tombrock assured them that there were much bigger difficulties out there, and they should feel lucky for the problems they had. Annabel thought it might be that they only had experience with one child, and she reminded Rupert that they were both only children too. "We're in a closed system," she said. Rupert could only nod pensively. And they did find bigger difficulties once school reopened. Finally back. Returning to school felt like his first day of kindergarten again. Everything was loud, smelly, and confused. There were 100 faces that seemed like ghosts. Subconsciously, Tigrid expected everyone to look just the same as they had a year and a half before, and their real faces fell into a kind of uncanny valley for him. He didn't like any of it. He felt like he was in a straitjacket all day with the strict routines. The mask bothered him more than ever. The elastic made his ears red after a full day, and he didn't like the constant smell of the artificial fabric or his own worsening breath. Aside from that, it was plainly illogical to think that they could work well. Just by spending all day in the same rooms, he and his classmates would all be breathing the same air eventually. Soon, he became a minor dissident. Miss Heather found herself reminding him to push his mask over his nose with regularity, and she even scolded him occasionally. This went poorly, because if there was one thing Tigrid had mastered, it was begrudging compliance. He would put the mask above his nose just as Miss March was about to say something, and as if he had just so happened to notice it himself. But then it would drop again, and he would pretend not to notice until she was just about to say something again. Then he would do this again and again and again. One day, the moment he got off the bus, he said to his mother, "These masks are stupid," cast his mask to the ground, and stomped on it as he went around his mother. That one simple word, stupid, made her feel like crying. She had seen it coming. He had talked about masks at the dinner table several times, and neither she nor Rupert could think of a good way to respond. They had even talked to Dr. Tombrock. They all agreed that second-guessing the school in front of Tigrid, even if they disagreed with it, would be a bad idea. But he said it was hard to say what to do since they hadn't met in so long. He suggested they should try to highlight how well he had done before in complying with the new rule. But she knew Tigrid would see right through that. And so, like a chess player who can see mate in 3, she could see there was only one way the conversation would end. She wished she could turn the king on its side and withdraw. But as his mother, she knew she couldn't. All she could do was play her next move and creep toward the inevitable disaster. She followed him inside and said, "It's to keep us all safe, honey. It's not perfect, I know. You've said so. But it lowers the risk of transmission." Tigrid's face was white with rage when she said that. "Not enough," he said. "Not enough what?" "It doesn't lower it enough." "What do you mean?" "It doesn't lower the risk enough to be worth it," he said, as if spelling it out for a child. "Tigrid, please." But he turned and went to his room. Freedom. With time, COVID passed, the masks came off, and as society thawed out, so did Tigrid. Like a receding glacier, he retreated from his tirades. He stopped judging Jay and Randall so unconditionally, and even started talking to Brienne a little. She had apparently started to notice Tigrid's work and listened patiently as he explained it to her. That summer was spent much the same way as the ones before, although they joined a hiking group so they could have a specific list of peaks to conquer. They started in on the 17 peaks up to 4,000 meters, and Tigrid wanted one day to take on the 14ers, peaks with at least 14,000 feet elevation. But after school started, he went back to establishing intellectual dominance over his peers. It was not as overt, but it felt like first grade all over again. They revived visits with Dr. Tombrock, and Tigrid told him about his days, focusing mainly on his projects and not his peers. The doctor told Rupert and Annabelle that progress was progress and that they needed a one-day-at-a-time strategy. Tigrid had felt the effects of being away from his peers, even though he was unusually independent. He couldn't quite be called solitary, and the lockdowns had been a setback. Patience was the main thing. This advice did not sit very well with the Schauts. He was nearly in middle school, and they felt like they were all the way back to the first year they had come to California. They felt like time was moving too fast for them. And yet, not knowing what else to do, they followed Dr. Tom Brock's advice. Tigrid dedicated himself more and more toward becoming a fighter pilot, which his parents encouraged wholeheartedly, hoping to channel his efforts in math and science toward something self-improving instead of competitive. And he started getting interested in remote control airplanes. This came mostly from the captain, who had a whole collection of them. His parents got him started with cars, and Tigrid would not just play with them, but take them apart and look up whatever diagrams of them he could online. He found online groups, which his parents looked on with wariness. They allowed him to access them only when he was in the room with Rupert. That was problematic. Since Tigrid had moved his project room back upstairs, it meant either he or Rupert would have to move. They compromised on installing monitoring software, which Tigrid, to his parents' relief, did not chafe at.